All right, so we're talking about minerals, and we're going to talk about major minerals and minor minerals. And minerals obviously are very important to human health. And so we're going to go through and talk about things like calcium, potassium, phosphorus, sodium, all of those important major minerals, or what we also call macro minerals. And then we'll cover the minor or the trace minerals, and that'll be like iodine, selenium, copper, all of those things, which happen to be pretty important for our health. But remember, the reason we call them major versus minor or major versus trace is not because one is more important than the other, but because one we have in greater concentrations in the body compared to the other. Okay, so having not enough copper or not enough iodine, even though it's a trace mineral, can be extremely life-threatening for us, as well as not having enough potassium. Okay, so major minerals are needed in amounts greater than about 100 milligrams per day. Okay, in comparison to the trace or minor minerals, which are only needed at about 30 milligrams per day or less. Okay? 20 to 30 milligrams per day or less. Right? And some of them as little as 5 milligrams per day. Okay? And this is just a chart showing you some of the minerals of the body. So you know, obviously, we'll go over calcium, but calcium is necessary for every single cell in the body. It's especially necessary for bones, muscle contraction, and that's not just skeletal muscle contraction. It's also going to be cardiac muscle as well as smooth muscle contraction. Okay, and iron, you know, we have that as part of our hemoglobin molecule. It does a few other things as well. And so we'll talk about what all of these minerals do for us as we go along, and what having too many of these minerals in our body can do versus not having as much as we need in the body as well. Now, minerals are inorganic, okay? So just so that you keep that in mind, these are not organic substances that our body needs. Minerals, because they're organic, they're relatively stable. And what that means is they don't break down very easily. So under ultraviolet light, you heat them up, you add extra oxygen, all that kind of good stuff. They don't lose their shape. And of course you can tell because rocks are full of minerals, and just because the sun shines on them every day doesn't mean that they, fall apart right away. Now the only exception is potassium. Potassium is a little more softer, gentler type of mineral. It can actually have some problems as far as its stability is concerned, and we'll talk about that too. Most of your minerals in our body are going to be ionic. So, for instance, sodium with the plus charge and chloride with the negative charge. And so some of these will bind together as they travel through the body, and then also separate as they're in the body as well. And these ions become very important in helping to maintain fluid balance and helping with contractility of muscles and so on. Some minerals we're going to see don't move in our system on their own. Some minerals are going to be attached to what we would call transport proteins. Like, for instance, iron very rarely floats through our bloodstream all by itself. Most of the time, iron is attached to a transport protein we call transferrin. And so this protein grabs a hold of iron, and iron floats around with this protein. It happens with many of the hormones of our body too. They are attached to various different proteins, and what that does is it won't allow the mineral or won't allow the hormone to have any kind of function at that time in the bloodstream. Until it breaks off of that transport protein, it's not able to do any kind of function. It allows us to have minerals or to have hormones floating in our blood at super high concentrations but they're not what we would call bioavailable, so they also don't hurt us in any way, even if they're in very high concentrations. When they enter into cells, we usually lose the protein portion of it, and then they can do their job while they're in the cell. Again, one of the ways that will increase what we call the bioavailability is that we break it off of the protein. Now, sometimes prior to being able to get these minerals into a usable form in our body, we have to cook the food that we eat. So for instance, if you're eating any type of beans and you're eating them raw, you're going to have a very hard time actually getting the mineral out of that raw bean to use it for your body, because beans have a lot of fiber. Fibers are typically protein-based, and those proteins grab a hold of those minerals that are found in that bean and won't let go of it, and our system can't digest the fiber, and so the minerals just come out the other end. So eating certain foods when they're raw doesn't give us all of the minerals that we need for the human body. Sometimes, for instance, we have to take certain vitamins in order to enhance how well we absorb certain things. So for instance, if you're drinking orange juice while you're taking your iron pill in the morning, let's say, you're much more likely to absorb that iron into your cell than if you drank it with water, if you took that iron with water. Because vitamin C helps to carry iron across through the cell membrane and into the cell, and it becomes much more usable for your body. On the other hand, if you have a patient who has a thyroid problem, one of the things you want to tell them is when they're taking their thyroid hormones, do not drink anything that has vitamin C in it, and don't take your iron at the same time, because it nullifies your hormones. So there's certain combinations that assist us in being able to have this availability of minerals, and there's other combinations that you just have to stay away from, and it's not a good idea. And we know, of course, like vitamin D, that helps us to absorb things like calcium, and we'll talk about all these vitamins next week. Now, also there's certain types of foods that if we're eating them together, and some of you may have picked diets like this, where I can't remember if you picked the combination diet, where you shouldn't eat certain foods with certain things. But for instance, it's very difficult to absorb some of the minerals that we need if you're drinking a lot of tea and coffee, because there are what are called polyphenols in tea and coffee, and they have a tendency to decrease your ability to absorb minerals like, for instance, phosphorus and calcium. They don't like to absorb very well when you're drinking tea. So if you're eating ice cream and drinking tea at the same time, you're less likely to absorb the calcium from that milk product than if you weren't drinking tea. Minerals help to maintain fluid balance, okay? So if you remember, if we're looking at a cell, okay, and this is our extracellular fluid out here, and our intracellular fluid here, where's our highest concentration of sodium? Intracellular or extracellular? Think about your neuron. Okay, we have a higher concentration of sodium in the extracellular fluid in comparison to the intracellular fluid, right? Much lower concentration. What about potassium? Intracellular has the highest concentration of potassium compared to extracellular. And you remember, this is not just the neuron, this is every single cell in the human body. When we talk about minerals, we can also refer to them as just plain old particles. And which way does water move? Wherever the highest concentration of particles is located, right? So ions have a lot to do with that, what we call particulate matter. Ions attract water. So if I have more than the normal amount of minerals in the extracellular fluid, I'm going to attract more than the normal amount of water into my extracellular fluid. Does that make sense? Okay? So if I have more sodium than I should hanging around in the extracellular fluid, I'm going to lose water from the intracellular fluid. It's going to follow the sodium into the extracellular fluid, and I'm going to have a lot of edema in my extracellular fluid. So our minerals, these ions, are going to help us to maintain fluid balance. And having the right concentrations of these ions inside and outside the cell, of course, is very important. And what helps us to maintain sodium-potassium concentrations? The sodium-potassium ATPase pump, right? Okay, very good. Minerals can also act as cofactors for enzymes. So you remember our good old enzymes, okay? You get that chemical A, chemical B that comes in here to our active site. And what are these chemicals called that come into the active site? Starts with an S. They're substrates. And what has to bind to this enzyme to make it to change shape and bring our substrates together? A phosphate. And where do we usually get that phosphate from? Good old ATP. Because phosphates can break hydrogen bonds, change the shape of the protein, make that enzyme bring those substrates together. We form a product. Except, not always. Because sometimes some enzymes require what we call a cofactor. All well and good that the phosphate comes along, but the enzyme still doesn't change shape until, like, the most normal cofactor that's going to be used would be copper. That's a very popular cofactor for enzymes. They love to have a little copper to come and bind and make their day, and then the enzyme will change shape and you get a product. So imagine if we have a person who is deficient in copper. They may have a very slow metabolism for certain types of metabolic processes in the body. How would you get deficient in copper? How could that possibly occur? Just seems like a weird problem, huh?
What has copper in it?
Ah, very good question. What has copper in it? Where do we find copper in nature? Dirt. Lots of copper in dirt. Matter of fact, one of the things that you'll see with people who are mineral deficient, they have a problem called pica. Oh, love that name, pica. What's pica? You start eating weird things that you shouldn't eat, like dirt. Okay? You see people eating dirt and you go, mineral deficiency. Now here's another weird thing. If you come across a person who eats a lot of ice, now they don't suck on the ice, they don't let the ice melt in their mouth. They've got to crunch and chew the ice, and they need to feel that crunch. What mineral are they deficient in? And we see this a lot in pregnant women.
Would it be iron?
Iron. How strange is that? Why would you want to crunch on water? I still can't figure it out. But they need to crunch on water. And some of these women will crunch so hard on ice cubes, they'll break their teeth.
But I would like to do that. It's not.
Yes, but there's a difference. Okay, if I tell you you can never ever crunch on ice again, are you going to flip out?
No.
Okay, they will. It's like they have to have their fix. Literally, they are in big trouble if they cannot crunch on this ice. And it is a sure sign of iron deficiency. If I said to you, if you crunch on ice again, your teeth will crumble out of your mouth, you go, oh, dang, I love to crunch on ice, but you know what, I love my teeth more. You would survive. They would not. They'd let their teeth crumble out. That's how bad it is.
Does it have to do with the degree of it? Like the degree of the deficiency, how bad they want it, or how
Yes,
often? Okay.
it absolutely does. The more the deficiency, the more they have to crunch on ice. And we're not talking just a little bit, like you have a soda, you drink, you eat a bit of the ice. No, we're talking all day long. All day long. They don't need the drink. They just need the ice. Yeah, so it's a bit different. Now, of course, minerals are, and we'll talk about this, but minerals are also involved in a lot of the different mechanisms of the body. So, electron transport chain, muscle contraction, production of ATP, transmission of electrical impulses down the neuron. These are all going to be using different minerals from the body. So this just shows you some of the most important of our major minerals like sodium, potassium, chloride ions, and where they're found. So saliva, gastric juices, the pancreas uses a lot of minerals, our large and small intestines, our sweat. We have a lot of minerals in all of these different bodily fluids. So minerals help to make up bones, they help to make up our teeth, and some of the minerals form something called hydroxyapatite. Now hydroxyapatite is actually crystallization of minerals. So there's certain minerals like calcium and potassium, sodium, that when they bind together, they form crystals. And believe it or not, the enamel of our teeth, our compact bone, is actually crystalline in structure. You have to get way down to an electron microscope level to see this crystalline structure, but our enamel is actually a crystalline type of structure. And so this is showing you a little bit. So the outer enamel of your teeth are made out of this hydroxyapatite, and I don't know if you can see this very well, but these are like long, spiky crystals, okay, made out of mostly calcium. And that is actually what the surface of our teeth look like. It's not this solid, smooth surface. This is really the enamel of our teeth. And our bones are much like this. Our bones, especially the compact bone on the outside, is actually mostly a crystalline-like structure. Now this is kind of out of place, but we've already talked about this. Depending on the concentration of the particles on whichever side of the membrane we're looking at, water's going to move to wherever there are the highest concentration of particles. Okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. And remember, as water moves, we refer to this as osmolarity, or we can also refer to this as tonicity. Okay? So let's talk about the first of our trace minerals, and this is going to be sodium. So we know that sodium is a cation. It's positively charged, Na+. Sodium loves to hang around in our body with chloride ions, which is going to be Cl-. And when we put sodium and chloride together, what are we making?
Salt.
Salt, absolutely. So 90% of the sodium we consume is just from table salt. It's really hard for Americans to be sodium deficient because we eat so much processed food already, and to make that processed food even remotely taste good, they massively add salt to it. So we have lots and lots of sodium in everything we eat, and we only need about a teaspoon and a half of sodium, which is our recommended allowance for sodium every day. A teaspoon and a half. There's a heck of a lot more that we're consuming. The American Health Association, or World Health Association, I should say, believes that Americans usually consume between 5 to 10 times the amount of sodium in our diet daily that we need. Like, for instance, how much sodium is in a tall Starbucks mocha frappuccino?
That one I don't know. I looked up the mango dragon fruit. That one has, I think, 30 per venti.
30 what, milligrams?
30 milligrams.
30 milligrams. Well, the frappuccinos have more.
Well,
They have a lot more.
So if a teaspoon and a half is like how much milligrams?
Let's see, if sodium, I think it's 3,500 milligrams if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to go back, don't quote me on that, but I think that's what it is. So we're consuming a lot more than that in our daily diet. Now, if you're eating mostly plant-based, or even if you're eating just regular meat and you're not eating processed foods, you will most likely have to add sodium to your diet, because most of our plants have very little sodium in it. And so if I'm vegetarian, I probably will need to salt my food. If I'm eating mostly meat and vegetables with maybe a little fruit mixed in, I probably will have to salt my food. It's the processed foods that get us, because they don't taste as good unless we add a lot of salt to them.
What about like bacon? Bacon is already high in salt.
Yes, there's some meat
Okay.
that's going to be higher in salt than others, absolutely. But most of the time, your bacon is made as a salted bacon. So you can get uncured or non-cured bacon, and it's not going to be salted. So if you're looking for a lower sodium diet, you want to, if you're going to eat bacon, you don't want it to be cured, because that's where they add all that salt. So sodium's absorbed by our small intestine. It travels through the blood, and then it can enter the cell. How does sodium enter our cell? What kind of transport allows sodium to mainly get into the cell? What kind of transport? So we have simple diffusion, we have facilitated diffusion, we have active transport. Primary active transport, secondary active transport. Which one does sodium like? Secondary. Secondary active transport is sodium's favorite way of getting into our cell, which also means that sodium typically enters the cell with something else. And sodium is usually coming into the cell, and something else is usually following on sodium's tail to get into the cell. It could be water. It could be glucose. Glucose loves to hitch a ride with sodium to get into our cell. There are several different chemicals that seem to want to hitch a ride with sodium to enter into our cells. And so sodium really likes to move by that secondary active transport. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but the adrenal glands and the kidneys are the major regulators of how much sodium we have floating around in our bloodstream. So we'll go through how they do that in just a few minutes. Really, it's a refresher for you, mainly. Once we have a lot of sodium in the blood, if we have too much and we don't need to use it, as long as our kidneys are healthy, we're going to excrete that excess sodium into the urine and get rid of it. Another way that we get rid of excess sodium is we sweat it out. Okay? So there's two ways to keep those sodium levels low. Because now think about it, one of the reasons why doctors recommend that you go on a lower sodium diet if you have blood pressure is because wherever sodium is at, water likes to hang around sodium. So if I have a lot of sodium in my bloodstream, I'm going to pull water into my bloodstream by osmosis, and anytime I add volume of water to my blood, what happens to my blood pressure? It's going to go up. Just add water, increase the pressure. So too much sodium in my blood, too much water in my blood. Too much water in my blood, too high of a blood pressure. So I want to be able to have nice healthy kidneys, to be able to excrete that excess sodium. I want to be able to sweat it out. Now, one of the problems also is your athletes. So what if I'm super athletic, and especially if, let's say, I'm in football training camp and I live in the high desert and I'm getting ready to play high school football and I got to go out and do training in July. Okay? We know what it's like in the high desert in July. What's going to happen to my athlete? Lots of sweat. What else? Lots of water, right? I'm going to drink a lot of water. I'm going to sweat out a lot. I'm drinking a lot of water, which also means I will pee a lot. One of the really serious problems for them are arrhythmias. Why?
Need salt to regulate your heartbeat.
Yeah, I have to have sodium to keep a normal heart rate. And if I'm sweating all the sodium out and I've drank so much water that I'm also peeing excessively, which is usually what happens, I lose sodium. And now I can have a heart coordination problem, I have skeletal muscle coordination problems, and I become very dehydrated, and this is very, very bad. So you have to be super careful of that dehydration, plus the excess of drinking. I mean, you may have heard, like, you know, they have these, well, they used to have these programs like on the radio, how much can you pee for a wee? And so they measure how much somebody would drink, and these people would drink and drink and drink and drink, and of course they'd have to urinate, and as they did, you're flushing all these minerals out, and especially sodium, which is a major regulator of our neurons and a major regulator of our cardiovascular system, and people were dying. So excessive hydration, excessive urination, I can lose a lot of minerals in this, and that's really bad.
Is that why a lot of athletes will have like Gatorade instead of water?
Yes. And especially if they're drinking the actual Gatorade, not the Pepsi changed it to taste all sweet Gatorade. The actual Gatorade was formulated by 2 physiology professors from the University of Florida, and they put in there, not glucose, they put in there mannose sugar. Mannose sugar crosses the blood-brain barrier and keeps your athlete more awake. And then they put in all the sodium and potassium and all those different things that they would need that they're sweating out. That's why the real true Gatorade is a little salty, funny tasting, but the new stuff that Pepsi makes, not good for you as an athlete. It doesn't really have all those nutrients in it and minerals that you need. So you got to drink that orange funky stuff. Do they even make that anymore?
Yeah.
Do they? They do? Okay. I wasn't sure because I know most of it is just the sweet stuff. Yeah. Okay, so we know that sodium, we talked about, it helps to regulate fluid balance, okay? And it transmits nerve impulses in muscle contraction. How does sodium play in muscle contraction again? What's its job? Oh, I'm hurting your head on this one. What's sodium doing in muscle contraction? Where does it come in? Think about those essays.
Does it have to bind to actin and myosin?
Sodium? Does sodium bind to actin and myosin? Mm-mm. What does sodium do for skeletal muscle contraction?
Does it when the neurotransmitter binds to the, when the neurotransmitter binds to the influx of sodium?
That's right. So remember, we're releasing acetylcholine from the motor neuron, and the acetylcholine is binding to the muscle, and that opens the sodium gates. Sodium diffuses in and starts the action potentials that spread across the surface of the muscle, and then calcium is released and starts the actin and myosin binding. Okay? So sodium is very necessary. It's the first ion that diffuses into that muscle that triggers muscle contraction. And of course, it's doing a very similar thing with cardiac muscle, although we don't use the motor neuron, it is still triggering those action potentials. So sodium also helps to transport several types of nutrients across the cell membrane. We talked about that secondary active transport. It likes to transport glucose across. Many of our amino acids move into our cells so that we can build proteins, piggybacking on sodium by that secondary active transport as well. Okay? Okay, so a diet too high in sodium, we talked about, can have problems with blood pressure. But here's something really interesting. If somebody has a diet that's too high in sodium, it can cause osteoporosis. Now, how does a diet too high in sodium create bones that don't have enough calcium? What do you think? How could that possibly occur?
Is it because when the calcium leaves the bone, it lowers our sodium levels?
Okay, that's an idea. What else? What do you think might happen where high concentrations of sodium could decrease the amount of calcium in your bone? Weird, huh? What's this hormone? Parathyroid hormone. And where do we make this hormone? The parathyroid gland, right? Okay. Where's the parathyroid gland located? Behind the thyroid. Okay. All right. So parathyroid hormone. What does it do? Stimulates osteoclasts. And what do osteoclasts do? And you get more calcium in your blood, right? Okay. So, what turns on parathyroid hormone? Low calcium levels in your blood. Or high sodium levels in your blood. Ouch. Now, they have to be pretty high enough that they'd raise your blood pressure, but also high enough that they could stimulate your parathyroid gland, and you'd produce too much parathyroid hormone, which would then cause osteoporosis. Not good. A diet too low in sodium is also harmful, okay? But it's very, very difficult for Americans to have a diet too low in sodium. Can you think of one of the negative effects of not having enough sodium? We already talked about it. Arrhythmia, absolutely. By the way, the number one cause of cardiovascular death is arrhythmia. The minimum amount of sodium needed, oh, I totally misspoke. I was thinking of potassium. You need 180 milligrams per day. That's your minimum needed. Your recommended dose, I said, was 3,500, but it's actually only 1,500 milligrams per day of sodium. Okay? The average American is consuming at least double, if not more, of sodium every day.
We're consuming 3,500.
Yeah. Yeah. Much more likely that that's what we're consuming, yes. So we get sodium besides all that processed food, packaged foods, cured meats like lunch meat, really super high in sodium, lunch meats, okay? Foods that don't have as much sodium would be more of the natural foods. So if you're eating carrots and peas and that kind of thing, not nearly as high in sodium. If you're eating uncured meat, not nearly as high in sodium. So even if you go to the store and you buy a steak, it's not super high in sodium. But if you go and buy cured bacon, it's going to be much higher in sodium because the curing process adds sodium to it. So a really good example of super high salt content would be like tomato sauce. So you go out and you buy Ragu or Prego or something like that, and it already has a lot of salt in it. But the weird thing is it doesn't taste very salty, so a lot of people will add salt to like their spaghetti or whatever, and now you have a really high sodium meal. Super duper high sodium. Excess sodium in the diet or in the bloodstream is called hypernatremia. And of course the number one problem with this is leading to hypertension. And for some reason, people who have more African genetics have a tendency to have greater issues with higher blood pressure because something is going on with the kidneys. Now, why that occurs is probably because they're less likely to be the kind of people who require as much sodium in their diet. If you kind of look at people and are hereditary, or heredity, I should say, where we come from normally in the world tells us the kinds of foods that our ancestors were eating for a long time would be the kinds of foods that we really need in our diet. So if you're coming from a part of the world that those foods would not normally have a lot of sodium, you genetically are not going to require a lot of sodium. You may come from other parts of the world where there's much less sodium in the soil. You might hereditarily need to add some sodium to the food that you eat because maybe your kidneys clear sodium out faster. If someone is coming from African descent, their kidneys don't clear sodium out as well. Their kidneys don't regulate sodium as well because they shouldn't be eating or consuming as much sodium because historically that's not what they did. So their kidneys don't have to be great in regulating sodium because they didn't normally eat that much. And then they move to, you know, some place like America where everything is processed and we have tons of sodium and everything, and we go, oh, I wonder why they have kidney problems. Well, it's kind of like no duh. They have kidney problems because they're eating like a different group of people would eat and pretty much be okay with it. And it's the same thing with other types of minerals. If you come from European descent or other types of foods, European descent, you should not be eating wheat. They didn't grow wheat in Europe, and people who are more white, you might say, our bodies don't do well with wheat, and we have a much greater problem with having allergies to various different chemicals in wheat, like that gluten thing going on, and we should be staying away from stuff like that. It causes all kinds of cancers and different, you know, issues. So it has a lot to do with our genetics and our background. We should not be consuming more than 1 tablespoon of salt per day, although that's probably twice the amount we actually need. And so 2,300 milligrams per day is all we need. Most people are consuming more than that, like we've said. If someone has hypernatremia, usually what we see is vomiting and diarrhea due to too much salt. And then, of course, we know that this contributes to a calcium deficiency and osteoporosis. So when the extracellular fluid becomes hypertonic, that means there's too many solids, too much sodium. We know that this is one of the reasons why having so much sodium in our diet allows fluid to move into the extracellular region and you get a lot of edema. Okay? So all that salt moves into your cell but can only be in the cell in a certain concentration. Our cells will only allow so much salt in. So if I'm consuming too much salt, all that extra salt is floating around in my bloodstream for a while, and then that salt can move into the extracellular space in between the tissues. And water can follow that, both from the blood, both from the intracellular fluid from my cells, and I get edema from too much salt in my diet. Now there is something called the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet. Did any group pick these diets? No? Okay, so I'm not giving anything away. The DASH and the Mediterranean diets were both diet plans to help to reduce hypertension or high blood pressure. Okay? And what it says is these are very low sodium diets. Mediterranean diet is a diet that is low in carbohydrates and low in sodium. You get all of your carbohydrates from plant-based materials. However, they can't be plant-based starch carbohydrates. So that means you're eating green leafy vegetables, you're eating beans, but you're not eating potatoes, rice, all that kind of stuff. And so usually you are eating below 140 milligrams of salt a day. If you have to go sodium free, They don't want you to eat more than 5 milligrams per serving of anything. So you could be eating very, very low sodium in the diet. So depending on how bad you are, the DASH diet has different degrees of the amounts of sodium that you should be consuming. But both DASH and Mediterranean diets, which by the way are highly successful in reducing hypertension, these diets are very natural, zero processed food diets, which would explain why they're good at reducing hypertension, because that would be a super duper healthy diet. Okay, so we talked about this is the primary cation in our extracellular fluid. It helps to regulate our tonicity or osmolarity. Hypernatremia, by the way, is very bad. In that also it can cause, I just told you, water to move from the intracellular fluid into the tissues. If that happens in the brain, it can actually shrink the brain cells, shrink the neurons, dehydrate them. And now one of the other problems with hypernatremia is you get lethargy. Your patient can have seizures. They can go into comas from having too much salt. Hyponatremia would be too little salt in your diet, and usually, again, this is due to excess sweating, although it could be also from excess vomiting. So if you have somebody who has like a flu or something like that, or maybe you have someone who's bulimic, and we have excess vomiting going on, you could lose a lot of minerals this way, especially sodium. And hyponatremia causes nausea, causes the lethargy also. It can create seizures as well, so kind of similar problems, whether it's hyper or hypo, it's just not good. And we talked about this is mostly going to be seen in people who are athletes or people who are sweating, and especially drinking excessive. You could also have this with your patients who are taking diuretics. Okay? So one of the things that diuretics do, in our kidneys we have sodium, potassium, ATPase pumps. And diuretics have a tendency to stop or slow down those pumps. Because what those pumps normally do is they cause sodium to be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. Okay? So as the urine passes through the nephron, the sodium, potassium, ATPase pumps are causing reabsorption of sodium. Does that sound familiar to you? Okay? But what happens if I turn those pumps off? Where's the sodium go now? Okay, so let's look at it. I know, I'm asking you to remember things that might have been a while ago. So if this is distal convoluted tubule, yeah? And this is collecting duct. You with me so far? Part of your nephron. And this is which capillary? Do you remember? What do we call those? Peritubular capillaries. And you have fluid going down the distal convoluted tubule. And there's a lot of sodium in here. And some of that sodium, I don't want to end up in the urine. I've filtered a lot of sodium out of the blood. I want this sodium to go back into the blood. And we say if we filter it out of the blood and we put it back into the blood, what do we call that? Reabsorption. Very good. How am I going to get sodium to move back into the blood? How do I get it back into the blood?
Change the permeability of the collecting duct.
Okay, how?
Hormone.
Okay, what else? How do I move sodium back into the blood?
Is it water?
Good try. How about if I use a sodium pump?
But I thought you said they were turned off.
Ah, only if I use a diuretic.
Oh.
If I have a sodium pump here, I can actively transport the sodium back in. Now, how do I turn these sodium pumps on? Which hormone do I use?
Oh, the AD or AT.
It's an A something.
Yeah.
Aldosterone. Okay? Aldosterone is going to regulate this pump. The more aldosterone, the faster the pump. The faster the pump, the more sodium goes back into the bloodstream. Where's aldosterone come from? Which part of the body makes aldosterone? Ooh, is your brain hurting? Asking you all these physiology questions. Comes from the adrenal cortex. So aldosterone controls the speed of the pump. That pump can help us to move sodium from the urine back into the bloodstream. Well, if I am consuming too much sodium in my diet, I have too high a sodium in my blood, I have too high a blood pressure, I'm going to take a diuretic that will not allow aldosterone to bind. It doesn't allow aldosterone to turn on this pump, and therefore I can't pump the sodium back into my blood, and that sodium ends up being flushed down the toilet. There's also one other pump that we never talk about in physiology. That pump is also on the distal convoluted tubule. This is also a pump that transports sodium back into the blood, but now look at what else it transports at the same time. It also transports calcium. It is also regulated by aldosterone. So one of the problems is if I take a diuretic, okay, and I can't get the sodium back in, I also could lose some calcium as well when I flush that toilet. So diuretics can be an issue of not having enough calcium in my blood as well. Yes, but it doesn't affect these pumps.
Okay.
Yeah. Now this pump that pumps sodium that's controlled by aldosterone, it is actually a sodium potassium pump. So when I actively transport sodium out of the urine and back into the bloodstream, at the same time I'm removing potassium from the blood and putting it into the urine. So I flush more potassium down the drain. But if I turn this pump off, guess what? I can now build up potassium in my blood as well, and this could be an issue for your patient. Too much potassium, which we'll talk about in a little bit, can be a potential issue as well. So when you're giving your patient a diuretic, you really have to monitor their sodium, their potassium, their calcium levels. This could become super duper big issues for them, especially if they're on high doses of diuretics for long periods of time. Because if I build up too much potassium in my system, it can cause my heart to stop. This is how we kill animals, put animals to sleep, is you give them massive doses of potassium in their blood. And it causes their heart and everything, their brain, the whole thing to freeze up. So you don't want your patient building up too much potassium in their system either. Any questions about this? Okay, so we just went through this a little bit. What we talked about is aldosterone coming from the adrenal cortex, but what chemical tells aldosterone to come from the adrenal cortex? Oh, I'm taking you back to that blood pressure essay.
Is it raining?
Remember those terms?
Yes.
Renin, angiotensin, aldosterone stuff. They actually call this, you'll hear this mostly in the hospitals, they call this the RAA system. This is a massive regulator of blood pressure. Where's renin come from? Kidneys, right? Where's angiotensin originally come from? Do you remember? Which organ makes angiotensinogen? Liver. Very good. And what does renin do to angiotensinogen?
What activates it?
Activates it. And we get what? Angiotensin 1. What causes angiotensin 1 to become angiotensin 2?
I'm the hardest.
Yes. You remember ACE? That enzyme converts 1 into 2. And 2 stimulates the adrenal cortex to make aldosterone. And we just talked about what aldosterone does. What if I gave your patient, instead of a diuretic that affects this stuff and causes all kinds of calcium and potassium issues, and I got to monitor them, what if I just said forget the diuretic thing? What I'm going to do is I'm going to give them an ACE inhibitor. How does that help their blood pressure?
Well, it stops aldosterone, doesn't
It does.
it?
You can't make as much aldosterone. Does that affect all their calcium and potassium and sodium now? Oh, heck yeah. It sure does. It's the same thing. I can either inhibit the pump directly and block aldosterone from binding, or I can just inhibit aldosterone from being made, but it still affects calcium and potassium and sodium concentrations. It's still a problem. This is much more effective at blocking those pumps. This is much more effective at lowering blood pressure. And this is what doctors are typically going to give to somebody to decrease blood pressure due to too much sodium, too much fluid intake. It's also believed that people of African descent don't seem to make as much ACE. They don't seem to make as much. And so they retain more sodium in their bloodstream, and they have higher blood pressure problems. So this RAA system for them just seems to be out of whack. It doesn't seem to be as sensitive as maybe someone from a different area of the world. Any questions about that?
Is the ACE inhibitor, is it an all or nothing thing?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
so there's no lowering of aldosterone.
Well,
There's just,
yes and no. So ACE inhibitor, when I give it, it's going to turn off aldosterone production. But it depends on the concentration I give it at. So if I give it a little bit, it'll turn off aldosterone production a little bit. The more I give, the less aldosterone you're making
okay.
all day long. Yeah. Okay. So one other thing. Let's go back to the collecting duct and then we'll take a little break. Remember, on the collecting duct, we have valves that open. And the idea is when those valves open, any water that's in the urine, now because we have pumped more sodium back into the bloodstream and reabsorbed the sodium, the water follows the sodium back into the bloodstream and we reabsorb water. What opens those valves? Which hormone opens those valves? Which hormone opens the valves on the collecting duct? $810 million if you get it right. Isn't that the lottery number today or something like that? It's ridiculous. I asked one of the math professors, so are you playing the lottery? He goes, it doesn't matter how much it is. Statistics say I'm not going to win. He's keeping his dollar. Charlia? I'll give you a hint.
ADH.
Yes! Woo! Bingo! You just won the lottery. I have nothing. Sorry. I don't even have a penny to give you. It is. It's anti-diuretic hormone. Now, what I want you to know, too, is anti-diuretic hormone is also called AVP. And in the hospitals, this is most likely what you are going to hear that they call it. This is called arginine vasopressin. AVP is the more common term for antidiuretic hormone now. So I just want you to be aware that it's there. Now, vasopressin, it means that it has to do with blood pressure. So like the vascular system, pressin for pressure. So this chemical helps to regulate blood pressure. So our potassium is mainly regulated by the sodium-potassium ATPase pumps. So if that pump is pumping 3 sodium out of the cell, at the same time it's pumping 2 potassium into the cell. Now we also excrete potassium through the urine. We also excrete potassium through sweat. And potassium, of course we know it is an ion, therefore that makes it an electrolyte, and it helps us to maintain our fluid balance because of the osmolarity issue, water moving back and forth with particles. 95% of the potassium in the body is located within the cells, and potassium helps to assist us in maintaining pH and our acid-base balance. So potassium is also helping us with conduction of electrical activity as far as the muscles are concerned, and that would include cardiac muscle. It's also helpful in maintaining blood pressure, which we talked about, those sodium-potassium pumps. And potassium causes the kidneys to excrete sodium. So if we have more potassium entering into the blood, that means less sodium enters into the blood, more sodium is entering into the urine. Potassium is going to be found mainly in fruits and vegetables. It is very difficult to eat too much vegetable matter to get excess potassium. So again, most of the time when we look at somebody who has excess potassium, it is usually because they're taking potassium tablets, or it's because they're eating a lot of food. Now, here's the thing. We don't really know what excess potassium is. So if you were to say how much potassium is too much, it really is kind of individual. And it is too much when you start to see symptoms. So potassium also helps to make the crystalline structure of bones. And it acts as a buffer in the bloodstream because the positive charges can bind to any of the negative charged bicarbonate ions. It also increases our bone strength, which we talked about. And potassium is helpful in reducing the formation of kidney stones. So the more potassium that you have in the system, the more potassium in the urine, the less likely that crystal formation into stones is going to occur. It actually prevents the crystalline structure of kidney stones from forming. The recommended dose of potassium is anywhere between 3,500 to about 4,500 to 4,700 milligrams per day for an adult. Most adults in the United States do not consume enough potassium. So if you were to look at your food chart, the likelihood is on a daily basis you don't get enough potassium. Some of the best sources would be bananas. They're very high in potassium. Watermelon, potatoes, your green vegetables, sweet potatoes, Dairy foods, super high in potassium. Some nuts are high in potassium. High doses of potassium, too much potassium in the system is called hyperkalemia. And usually the only time we see hyperkalemia in someone is if they have already a certain type of disease state which damages the kidneys, and therefore it damages the sodium-potassium ATPase pumps. And so the person maintains too much potassium in the bloodstream, and this would be especially people who are diabetic, people who have had long-term blood pressure issues, people who have been taking diuretics for long periods of time. These are the type of people we typically see hyperkalemia in. There's also hypokalemia, and this is too low of blood levels of potassium. And this would be an individual that is not eating appropriately, or maybe someone who has long-term vomiting issues. So we do see this in people who are anorexic. We do see this in people who have bulimia. We also see this in people who have had some type of intestinal weight reduction surgery. So if they do the stomach types of surgery, some of these are pretty radical, where the entire stomach is removed, or maybe as much as 3/4 of the stomach is removed. And where our body absorbs most of the potassium from the food that we eat is through the wall of the stomach. And so if we remove much of the stomach, your patient may have some hypokalemia issues, and those issues can be really, really bad. Some of you I may have told, I had a student in one of my physio classes a number of years ago who she had radical bypass surgery and had all of her stomach removed. So that basically the esophagus was then attached to the small intestine. Now that isn't done as much anymore. This was, again, like I said, a couple of years ago. And so her ability to absorb potassium was almost zero. Within about 9 to 10 months after having the surgery, she ended up dying. Because even though they were giving her IVs of potassium, it just wasn't holding in her system. For some reason, it looked like it changed the biochemistry of most of her body system because her stomach was missing. We don't really know everything that the intestinal system does for us. You know, there's a lot of studies that are going on all the time now about the gastrointestinal system, and we're finding there are more and more hormones that it makes, and how much more it controls different things in the body. There's a really good direct connection between the gastrointestinal system and the brain. And there's a lot of talk between those two systems, a lot of different hormones, a lot of what we call neuropeptides that are being produced that 10, 15, 20 years ago we didn't even know they existed. For instance, there is a hormone that the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum, makes. It's a hormone they call bombesin. They believe it is a major regulator of parturition. You know what parturition is? Parturition is what causes that trigger to say, okay, baby, today is the day that you're born. You want to talk about weird? The small intestine seems to be the major regulator to say that this is the day your child is going to be born. That's just freaky. I can't even remotely tell you why that would happen. It just doesn't make any sense to me at all. But it looks like that hormone plays a super big part in triggering the whole labor process in the female so that the baby's born. It's strange. So taking the stomach out, exactly what does that do to us? Well, we're learning because, you know, doctors have done this to people, and scientists are studying these people like they're guinea pigs. One of the issues with hypo and hyperkalemia is that they have a lot of the same symptoms. So with hypo and hyperkalemia, you see muscle weakness. That's a really big first symptom. Now, here's another way for your patient to get hyper or hypokalemia: certain medications. So there are a lot of medications that affect how well we absorb potassium or how much potassium we excrete. And so you have to watch your patient's potassium levels as you do blood work on them. Hyper and hypokalemia can also cause muscle cramping. And both of them can cause irregular heartbeat, and they can both cause paralysis. So if hypokalemia causes something, usually hyper causes it as well. All right, so we talked all about that. And we talked about this. So these are just some of the reasons for hypo and hyper: starvation or anorexia, diarrhea, certain diuretics. And then there's other medications too, like beta agonists. These are medications that cause the heart to beat faster in a person. These can cause issues with potassium levels. By the way, there's also a disease state called rhabdomyolysis. And rhabdomyolysis is very interesting. This is typically an autoimmune disease. And this is where the immune system attacks a person's muscles and literally starts eating up their muscles and destroying their muscles. So one of the first symptoms of rhabdomyolysis is that the person can't even lift their arms above their shoulder height. Now, I can have the same type of symptoms with hyperkalemia, and it might be mistaken for rhabdomyolysis. So only blood work testing is going to be able to tell me if I have the autoimmune disease or I have a potassium excess in my bloodstream. Okay, so chloride ions. We know this is an anion. As it floats through our body, it is typically attached to a sodium ion. And of course, that's what we're going to find mainly in our food source is sodium chloride. Okay. This is a major ion in the human body. It also will bind to hydrogen ions. And so in the stomach, we see chloride ions and hydrogen ions bonding together to make that good old hydrochloric acid. And what's hydrochloric acid in the stomach good for? Yeah, it just dissolves pretty much anything that you throw at it. Okay, it's a very, very strong acid. And of course, we're going to get these chloride ions in the food that we eat. We usually absorb it through the wall of the small intestine and directly into the bloodstream. We lose chloride ions in our feces. We lose it in our urine. And of course, we also lose chloride ions in our sweat. Chloride ions, remember, it's just like sodium ions, just like potassium ions. You can think of them as particles. And anywhere these ions are located, water is attracted to them. So depending on the amount of chloride ions, it's going to play a part in fluid balance. So the more chloride ions I have in my extracellular fluid, the more water is going to follow into the extracellular fluid. And because I have more sodium in the extracellular fluid than in the intracellular fluid, I typically also have more chloride ions in the extra versus intracellular. Now, by the way, chloride ions will also bind with potassium. They're negatively charged. They don't mind hanging out with potassium. They do prefer sodium, but they're okay with potassium too. If they need to, they're okay with hydrogen ions as well. Recommended daily dose for chloride is about 23 milligrams per day, and we typically get that because we're eating salt, and so we usually have more chloride ions than we need. The kinds of foods that we're going to get chloride ions in are anything that's salty: tomatoes, olives, even lettuce has chloride ions in it, like iceberg lettuce. There are some types of salts that are different. They're not sodium chloride, they're potassium chloride. They do have a different kind of taste, but you can use that salt on your food. Now let me just ask you this. What if a doctor says, oh, you're eating too much salt, so your blood pressure is high. I want you to cut down on the amount of salt. So I decide I'm going to try to be all smart about this, and so I see that salt is sodium chloride. So I go to the grocery store or the BJ's, whatever, and I buy potassium chloride. Will that be okay? It's still kind of a salty taste. Is potassium chloride okay? Yes? No? Some of you are saying no. Others are just staring. What do you think?
I guess no.
You would guess no? Why would you guess no?
Seems too easy.
Okay, well, all right. Why else would you say no? Because no is the correct answer.
You're still getting chloride.
You're still getting chloride, but you're not getting sodium.
No, you're getting
You're getting potassium.
It's different.
Say it again.
It's a different structure, it's different altogether.
Yeah, but does that help with my blood pressure?
No.
No, because look, okay? It doesn't matter if it's sodium, it doesn't matter if it's potassium, it doesn't matter if it's chloride ions. Okay, remember I got this beaker, I'm going to fill it up with water. And then I'm going to put a membrane in between. And on one side, we'll say this is A and this is B, and I'm going to put particles over here and not as many here. Does it matter which particles I put on either side in the ability for water to move? Nope, it doesn't. So if I tell you these particles are sodium, or I tell you these particles are chloride, or I tell you these particles are potassium, water doesn't care. Water is always going to move in this direction, right? So the more particles I have in my bloodstream, the more water is going to move into my bloodstream. The more particles I have in my tissues, the more water is going to move into my tissues, right? But water isn't picky. It will move whether it's sodium, potassium, chloride. So if my patient thinks that they're being smart and they don't put sodium chloride on their food anymore, they put potassium chloride, you got to tell them it doesn't matter. A particle is a particle, and water loves particles, likes to party with particles, okay? Wherever particles are, water's going to hang out with them. Doesn't matter what kind of ion it is. Okay, so we can have chloride toxicity, and we should not be eating more than 3,600 milligrams of this per day. And of course, if we have chloride toxicity, we're probably going to have hypernatremia too, which most people do. The one exception for chloride toxicity, we don't see this very often, is with dehydration. So the more dehydrated a person is, the more concentrated their blood becomes. And then that can cause some really serious issues. So you might see this in an emergency room in the high desert in the middle of summer. It is a possibility. Chloride deficiency is very rare, but again, we can see it with people who have had excessive vomiting, excessive diarrhea, okay? Could we also see a chloride deficiency with excessive sweating?
Yeah.
Absolutely, because they're sweating out too much of this chloride, which is why some of your workers who are working outside all the time, maybe like doing carpentry and things like that, they'll also pop like electrolyte pills, you know, different ions in these, like almost like, I don't know if you have horses or anything, but horses have to have a certain amount of minerals every day, so you buy your horse a big salt lick, and they lick all these minerals, and if you're outside and you're sweating a lot, you have to have your salt lick. So they pop these little salty pills, and they have chloride and sodium and potassium in them, and keep you from having these hypo levels. All right, calcium. Most of the calcium in our body is located in our bones and in our teeth. However, every single cell of our body requires calcium every single day. So we have some organelles that also store calcium in our cells. Which organelles do that? Which organelles are storage tanks for calcium? There's two. The smooth ER and the rough ER.
Oh, okay.
So both of the endoplasmic reticulum are really good at storing calcium. And although you know what our bones are for, you know, they help to keep our form, help us to move, all that kind of stuff, you can also think of them as a major storage tank for calcium in case, let's say, I decide to go on a fast. And I'm not going to eat anything for 10 days, okay? I doubt that will ever happen. But anyway, we'll pretend. And so I'm not going to eat for 10 days, which also means I'm not going to have any calcium intake, but my cells require a certain level of calcium. What they're going to do is they're going to leach that calcium from the bone. And we already talked about the fact that parathyroid hormone is going to be necessary to cause that calcium removal from the bone. And then I can deliver that calcium to all of my cells. Okay, so let's go through this really quick because this is also super duper important. Now let's say that this is going to represent my small intestine, okay? And it doesn't really matter which part of the small intestine, it pretty much happens all the way through. And then I have blood vessels. And I just ate lunch and I had some yogurt and some cottage cheese and I had ice cream afterwards. So lots and lots of calcium in the meal that I just ate. Tons of calcium. Now, in the walls of my small intestine, okay, I have gates that calcium can easily diffuse through and enter into my bloodstream. And I can use that calcium and put it into all my cells, my bones, whatever, and stay nice and healthy. However, there's a couple of things you need to know about these gates. Number one is that these gates have a receptor on them. And what has to bind to the receptor to open the gate is vitamin D. If you don't have enough vitamin D in your diet, you can't open the calcium gates. And even though I just ate a lot of calcium in my diet, if I didn't also have enough vitamin D hanging around, I couldn't open the gate. I couldn't absorb calcium from the small intestine into the bloodstream. The next thing you need to know is this receptor that my vitamin D is going to bind to is specifically controlled, the health of the receptor is controlled by a hormone, which is estrogen. So let's say now you have a woman who is over the age of 55, and so she has become what we call postmenopausal. Menopause is where the hormone levels in the female have changed so that she does not have a menstrual cycle for one entire year. That's menopause. If her cycle is kind of funky and she's kind of getting a little older and she doesn't have a period here and she doesn't have one there, we'd say she's premenopausal. If she's gone for a year plus and hasn't had her period, we would say she's postmenopausal. And what is causing this is a decrease in the follicles in her ovaries. She's not making those follicles anymore. They're not turning into eggs. And because they're not turning into eggs, she's also not producing estrogen. So her estrogen levels have dropped and her menstruation has decreased. Now, because our estrogen levels have also dropped, it affects many different cells in her body, and some of those cells are found in the small intestine. And now, if she doesn't have as much estrogen, some of these receptors actually disappear. They're not even there. And she might be taking tons of vitamin D, and she might be taking tons of calcium, but what good does that do her if there are no receptors there? If there are no receptors, the vitamin D can't bind to anything, the gates can't open, she can't absorb calcium anyway.
Women that take birth control, does it mess with that as well?
It can,
Okay.
yes. Long-term birth control can cause a decrease in these vitamin D receptors, and some of the science has shown that they're a little bit more susceptible to osteoporosis at a younger age. But these are women who have been on birth control like for 20 solid years. So you're on really long-term birth control. And most doctors won't let women be on birth control that long. So it becomes an issue. So this is what that decrease in estrogen does when somebody becomes postmenopausal. Now the really good thing is, especially for you all, is that they're coming up with multiple medications that you can take that allows calcium to be absorbed through routes that it normally can't be absorbed through. So calcium is kind of hitchhiking its way through other gates because of this medication and being absorbed back into the bloodstream. And so women are not having as big of osteoporosis issues. Now guys do the same thing. Their estrogen levels as they get older drops as well. And osteoporosis is a potential problem for men. Okay? However, men typically have more muscle than women. And muscle is attached to bone. And every time you move a muscle, it pulls on the bone. And every time it pulls on bone, it stimulates bone growth. So the more you use muscle, the heavier the items are that you can pick up, the thicker your bones will be. This is why they say exercise is really good to prevent osteoporosis later in life, because if you start off with bigger muscles, you will also start off with thicker bones. If you look at a man's bones at the age of 25 and you look at a man's bones at the age of 75, they are thinner. They are. However, they're not as thin as a woman's bones at the age of 75. Because at 25, her bones are much thinner than a man's bones at 25. And at 75, her bones are much thinner than his bones. Even though he's lost bone mass, they're still nice and thick, and the likelihood of them cracking and breaking isn't all that big of a deal. The more petite a woman is, the tinier her bones are, the less likely she is to pick up heavy things as she's young, the much greater likelihood is that she will have osteoporosis so bad that you could pick up her bones and see through them. And they have a tendency to shatter when she reaches 75. So stimulating bone growth occurs by lifting weights or doing things that are like anti-gravity exercises that helps to put more calcium in the bone. There's that good old hormone called calcitonin. Calcitonin is stimulated by exercise. Where's calcitonin made at in the body? Remember? Thyroid. So calcitonin comes from the thyroid. If you turn it around, you've got the parathyroid, which is where parathyroid hormone comes from. So if I do more anti-gravity exercises, I mean, even if I pick up a heavy trash bag and take it out to the trash, that's an anti-gravity exercise. That actually helps to stimulate calcitonin. And calcitonin turns on those good old osteoblasts, and if you remember osteoblasts, they help to grow bone. They make your bones thicker. Now, by the way, how scientists learned this is they started sending men into space. And there is no gravity in space, so you can't do anti-gravity exercises. So even though these people were eating calcium, their calcitonin was never produced. And so they'd spend 2, 3, 4 weeks or months out in space, and they'd come back and their bones were so brittle that when they tried to walk in a gravity environment, some of their bones would break. they would have to actually have these astronauts stay in their seats where they were at and pick them up like fragile little old men and put them on gurneys and take them into the hospital and build their bones back up. Because some of them would walk out and have multiple cracked bones. This is also why they built gravity chambers in these space stations now, and people have to go in these gravity chambers a couple times a day and do different exercises to keep the density and the thickness of their bone up.
Did you say a thyroid removed or a thyroid problem?
Well, if you have your thyroid removed, then you will have to take calcitonin as a medication. Just like you'd have to take thyroid hormone, you have to take calcitonin too. So it does become an issue if you have to have your thyroid removed as far as bone density is concerned, because it's really difficult, because usually when you have your thyroid removed, you take all those hormones in the morning, and you have this high concentration in the morning, and then all day long, the concentration goes down, 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 until it's almost nothing at nighttime. And that's not usually how we make it naturally. We make hormones up and down all day. So it does become a health issue for your patient. Any other questions? All right. We've talked about all that.
Another thing.
Yeah.
So there are people taking estrogen hormone pills.
Yes.
Would it safe?
Oh, that is an excellent question. Probably for a short period of time. So there's a lot of different studies that have been going on about, is it a good thing or isn't a good thing to take estrogen once you become that postmenopausal person. And it used to be that they told women absolutely positively, you need to take estrogen, you should probably start taking it before you even go through menopause, get those estrogen levels up because you don't want osteoporosis. And one of the things about estrogen when someone is younger, whether you're male or female, estrogen seems to be a protective hormone. It protects us from cancers, it protects us from high blood pressure, it protects us from all kinds of different issues. If you take that estrogen away from a young person, okay, you lower their estrogen levels when they're young, let's say something happens to their adrenal glands, they can't produce as much estrogen, they're much more susceptible to cancers and high blood pressure, they have all kinds of other issues. But then, they started giving women estrogen after menopause, and it seems to flip after menopause. Instead of estrogen being protective after menopause, it seems to now cause these issues. So that if I take too much estrogen for too long of a period of time after I've gone through menopause, I'm much more susceptible to cancers. I'm much more susceptible to high blood pressure, to diabetes, to a whole ton of issues. So what they're saying now is, if your doctor prescribes estrogen for you once you go through menopause, you should not take it for longer than 3 years. However, they recommend you don't take it at all, if you can possibly help it. Now, some women take estrogen because they can't stand the hot flashes and they can't stand, literally it's rewiring of your brain that is occurring. During that time, that 1 year, maybe 2 years, you're getting this rewiring of your brain as the estrogen levels drop. And so your thermostat isn't working very well, you get a little on the pissy side, you get a bit on the depressed side, nobody quite likes you, you don't quite like anybody, you don't care if they like you, you know, screw them. I mean, there's just all kinds of issues that happen. So what some doctors say is the issues are too dramatic for some women, so we're going to put them on some low doses of estrogen, and during this time we'll taper them off, and it tapers them off a little bit slower, and their family doesn't want to kill them as much, and so they can handle going through the whole change. But it is highly recommended that after a maximum of 3 years you get off of it. that you do not keep going because you're going to suffer this high blood pressure, high incidence of cancer, all that kind of stuff.
Do men go through menopause?
No. Okay, I don't care what your psychology teachers say, send them my way. We'll have a discussion here. Physiologically speaking, there is no such thing as male menopause. Now, whether they get screwed up in the brain because they hit a certain age and now they feel like, oh, their life is at an end, or I don't know. It's all psychology crap to me, so I don't really care. And it's okay, because I have a psychology daughter. We talk about this crap all the time, right? There's nothing that shows there is any change in male hormones to create the issue that happens when female hormones change, and it physiologically changes their body. It changes their brain, it changes their neurons, it changes their heart. We don't see that in men. So this may be a family issue, a psychology issue, it could be a whole bunch of other issues, but they call it male menopause, but biologically, you don't see any hormone changes at all. At all. Now, I've even heard people in the psychology realm call it andropause, because testosterone falls under a group of hormones called androgens, and they call it andropause. Well, I'm sorry, their testosterone levels don't change. You don't actually see in a healthy male, you don't actually see their testosterone levels falling until they're about 70 years old. That's when we really see a decrease in testosterone levels in a male. And when I say really see a decrease, I mean a little tiny one. Okay? Because men can still have children. They produce sperm at 70 years old. Okay? Watch out for those sperm. They are tricky creatures. Okay? You think they can't have babies when they're 70, 80, 90 years old. You wrong. Okay? They can.
Would the baby be healthy though?
Say it again?
Would the baby be healthy?
Absolutely, because here's the difference again between men and women. Sperm are produced all the time. For women, those eggs were produced when they were born. So if I'm 50 years old and I still have any eggs in my ovaries, they're 50 years old too. So they get old and they don't develop as well if they try to develop into a fetus. But for the male, he doesn't start producing sperm until he goes through puberty, so he's older when it starts, and he's producing sperm every 30 days. It's new and fresh every 30 days. The only thing that will decrease sperm count that we really see now that's a big deal are sexually transmitted diseases. Now, men can have injuries and things like that that could decrease sperm count, but the big problem that we see if men have sterility problems like that or low sperm count are usually due to STDs. Because for men, a lot of STDs, unfortunately, it's the same thing for women, they have no symptoms. So especially like chlamydia, it's like the #1 STD to cause low sperm count. The guy has 0 symptoms. So he has no idea if he has it or not. And it's not like you can turn on the lights and see if she has it too. Because I used to tell people, make sure you turn on the lights. If you don't know her that well, sort of, check her out. Because I had a student come to me one time and go, Dr. Harvey, I picked this girl up at a bar and we went home and had sex. And I'm just wondering if I should be concerned because she had like red sores all over her. And you still picked her up? And then you still had sex with her. Okay. I'm like, no, don't be concerned, it's fine. Okay, because you're an idiot, so. You'd be surprised some of the questions students ask me. I'm like, do I look like I really want you to ask me that question? I don't. I really don't. By the way, calcium ions, like a lot of the other ions, they bond to proteins while they travel through the bloodstream to one place to another. Calcium is needed to keep our blood vessels nice and dilated. So calcium also does play a role in making sure that your blood vessels don't constrict too much, and so therefore you don't have high blood pressure. Calcium also is a major player in blood clots. If you don't have calcium, you can't make a blood clot. And there are times when we need our blood to clot, obviously. Okay, so here's another really interesting thing. Many scientists for a long time believed that if you had a diet that was too high in calcium, that the calcium would cause kidney stones. Now they know that it is absolutely the opposite. A diet too low in calcium will make you much more susceptible to having kidney stones. Because here's what happens. The lower the calcium in my diet, the more parathyroid hormone I make. And the more parathyroid hormone I make, the more I suck calcium out of the bone. And parathyroid hormone is not super good at figuring out how much calcium to suck out of the bone. And usually if my parathyroid hormone goes too high, I suck too much calcium out of my bone. That calcium ends up in the kidneys, and it will mix with other ions that are also in the kidneys, and they'll all crystallize. And you'll get a good old kidney stone. And those stones can be really teeny tiny, and you may never know you have one, and it just goes through the kidneys and passes out. Or they could be much larger, and you'll really know you do have one. They say that getting a kidney stone is kind of like giving birth. It's so extremely painful. So gentlemen, if you ever want to know what birth felt like, get yourself a kidney stone. You'll probably figure it out. But I hear it's probably one of the most painful things that you can go through in life. I don't know, I was stepped on a horse. I haven't found anything more painful than that quite yet. She just got pissy one day. I don't know what happened to her. And she's just like, screw you, get off my back. I've been riding her for 10 years. She just was pissed off that day. And not only did she throw me off her back, which is fine, that's okay, I landed in some sand. Then she turns around and comes back and steps on me. Poof! I'm like, I don't know what happened to her.
What, did you keep her?
Oh yeah, sure, I still have her. She's 30 years old now. But the only people who ride her now are under the age of 10. I kind of figured out she hates adults, and she loves children. Loves children. The tinier the child, the better behaved she is. She was actually, the other day, we had some kids who came and visited, and she leans way out over the fence to try to get them to pet her and everything. Well, she was leaning too far, and the fence started to break. And the problem is, if a horse leans too far, it loses its balance, and it looked like she was going to fall on those kids. I don't know how this horse did it. She became like this trick pony. I mean, she's not a pony, she's a big horse. But she somehow wrangled her body so that she jumped with this fence, jumped around those kids, never touched them, almost killed the adults that were there with her hooves and all coming flying at them, but she never hurt one of those children. She's like, screw the rest of you who are over 3 feet tall, you know, but didn't hurt those kids. No. That was the last time I rode her. I wanted to turn her into glue and eat her, but my daughter's like, no, it was probably your fault. Probably was, but whatever. So calcium, of course, also helps us with all kinds of other things. And some of the things that we know that will trigger obesity is a lack of calcium in our diet. So if you've ever heard people say, oh, if you eat more milk products, you have a lower likelihood of obesity, that seems to be very true for most people. Because some people believe, at least some scientists believe, that calcium may actually increase our body temperature. And anytime our body temperature is elevated, it's usually because our metabolism is elevated, things are going faster. That also helps us to break down fat more, and we become a more healthy person. It's kind of interesting. The recommended daily dose for an adult not going through menopause is about 1,000 milligrams per day. A female who has gone through menopause, it is about 1,500 milligrams per day. Most people don't have enough calcium in their diet. It's just the way it is. We just don't have enough calcium. If you're going to take calcium, you want to take calcium that's fortified with vitamin D And vitamin D comes in different forms. It comes in 1, 2, and 3. The most likely form that helps you to absorb calcium is 3. So you want to take calcium that also has vitamin D3 in it, also known as cholecalciferol. Really hard to get hypercalcemia or high calcium levels. It's usually because somebody has some kind of disease state and the calcium starts to accumulate. And again, most of us are hypocalcemic. We're usually pretty deficient in calcium. Most people don't eat a lot of milk products, and so they usually don't have calcium. So it is recommended to take calcium supplements. The most likely type of calcium supplement is what's called calcium carbonate, but you also have something called calcium citrate. Calcium citrate's usually a little gentler on a person's stomach. There's also calcium that you can get like in oyster shells and bone meal, and it's more like supposedly the natural kinds of calcium. Be really careful of that. Make sure it's pure, because usually oyster shell and bone meal also have lead in it. You want to make sure the calcium's been purified, because you don't want to take calcium with lead in it. That would really suck.
Does Mexican candy still have lead in it?
You got me, I don't know. Okay, so phosphorus, this is very important. We need it for our bones. We do have some phosphorus that we use for our muscles, our cell membrane. We have some phosphorus for our extracellular fluid. It's absorbed through our small intestine. It also is absorbed due to vitamin D, helping it get through the gates. Parathyroid hormone activation helps to stimulate reabsorption of phosphorus from the bone. So if you need phosphorus in your cells, just like with calcium, parathyroid hormone leaches that phosphorus out of the bone and helps our cells. Phosphorus also works with calcium to form hydroxyapatite, which is part of the enamel of our teeth. It's part of our bones as well. And phosphorus is what we use to turn into phosphate to make good old ATP. Phosphorus is also part of our DNA, because we take that phosphorus and make it into phosphate. And you have phosphate deoxyribose sugar binding. Same thing with RNA. You have phosphate and ribose sugar binding to make RNA. We need about 700 milligrams per day of phosphorus. And usually it's very abundant in the food that we eat in the United States, so very few people are deficient in phosphorus. We can get this from beans, nuts, seeds, cereal grains, peas. The only problem is if you drink caramel-colored sodas that are carbonated, this is not good for phosphorus. Number one, it doesn't allow you to absorb phosphorus well, and number two, it breaks phosphorus out of your bone and can increase your risk of osteoporosis. So Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, all those cool, wonderful drinks, very, very bad for your bones. Hyperphosphatemia, you very rarely see this except for in patients who are on dialysis. So they have kidney issues and they can't clear the phosphate out of their system. Hypophosphatemia, again, typically don't see this in the United States, but this is usually people who are under starvation conditions. And one of the big things about hypophosphatemia is your patient has a lot of what they would call deep bone pain. High phosphate levels or low phosphate levels can cause death. Doesn't matter which one, it's bad for you. You don't want it. Magnesium, another major mineral, part of your bones, part of your muscles. Okay? You don't have a lot of magnesium need in the body, but the little bit that you do need is very important. Typically, you absorb about 50% of the magnesium that you eat in your diet. And the levels of magnesium are controlled by how well you absorb them through your small intestine, how much your kidneys are getting rid of the magnesium. Now, magnesium is associated with over 300 different types of enzymatic reactions in the body. So one of the big deals about magnesium is if you have a patient who is super duper tired all the time and you can't figure out why they're tired, they may have a magnesium deficiency. You can't even make ATP without magnesium because the enzyme ATP synthase won't work unless magnesium is bound to it. So magnesium becomes a very important mineral, especially for energy. You need magnesium to be able to produce DNA, to produce RNA. You need magnesium during cellular replication. You need magnesium with the ATP process. And they think that magnesium may help to decrease your risk of diabetes. So it helps in the production of insulin and release of insulin. About 300 milligrams of magnesium per day for men, about 400 milligrams, or excuse me, I got that backwards. For women, about 300, for men, about 400. Many Americans are typically low in magnesium. Now, some people, when they take magnesium, it makes them nauseous, but you can also buy a spray that is actually a magnesium oil, and we can absorb magnesium very easily through the surface of our skin as well. Okay. Foods that have magnesium: green leafy vegetables, whole grains, beans, fruit, dairy food. Coffee, tea, cocoa contain a little magnesium. Okay. Magnesium supplementation is the most likely problem for having too much magnesium. And it can cause diarrhea. That's the big, big deal with magnesium, is really bad diarrhea. But you could get cramps in your muscles, nausea. Talked about osteoporosis. We're just going to move on from there. Oh, this is just a nice picture. You can see the density of the bone here and how as osteoporosis occurs, what happens to the bone. This is the end of the femur, and look at how it's just worn away over time. You can actually see the inside of the spongy bone over time. This is a DEXA scan, and it is a type of X-ray transmission, and this is what they use for bone density.